So maybe after last week you went out and got some extension tubes, or you've got a macro lens and you're like, okay, I'm ready to do some of those close-up shots. And if you've played around with it though, you might have noticed things are different and that the photos aren't turning out the way that they are in my head. Like, what's going wrong here? Well, never fear. Today we're gonna dive even deeper into this month's Bite Shot Book Club reading, The Complete Guide to Macro and Close-Up Photography, and share with you some of the key differences to shooting macro photography that you've got to pay attention to so that the visions that you have in your head for your shot can become a reality. What's shaking bacon? I'm Joni Simon. Welcome to my studio. This is where I do food photography, and the goal here is to improve your food photography skills so you can feel confident behind the camera. And like I mentioned, we are diving deeper into this book here today. You may have noticed, if you've got the book, there's quite a few bugs and mushrooms, and so maybe this will inspire you to like a whole new avenue of opportunity. I'm not necessarily a big bug fan, but maybe it could be a lot of fun to shoot them. But what I want to focus on here today is starting on page 15. Very key phrase. It's almost as if it's hiding in the page. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of charts, a lot of graphs. I've heard from a couple of you go, oh, this book is really technical, Joni. Yes, I know there's a lot of numbers going on here. Here's what is most important, what I want you to take away. As the magnification factor increases, the depth of field shrinks down to values as small as fractions of a millimeter. You start going, okay, Joni, fractions, millimeters. For those of you who are like me and you're here, you're going, I'm no good at math. I just want to create pretty pictures. This is so much to ask, but this is an important concept to understand because it really unlocks macro photography, in my opinion. So the magnification factor is the relationship between the object that we're photographing. How big is it in real life? If we were to measure it with a tape measure, what's the size of that? Then in relationship to what is the size then being projected onto the camera's sensor. And most standard non-macro lenses are making that image smaller. They're taking that subject and kind of shrinking it down in a sense, as opposed to like putting something under a microscope. You put that object under a microscope and that microscope makes it a whole lot larger. And what's different about a macro lens versus non-macro lenses is that we're getting a greater magnification factor. We're getting at least a 1-to-1 ratio. And if we again go back to what did they say, is that as that magnification factor increases, the depth of field shrinks down. And so if you're used to shooting with non-macro lenses and suddenly you jump into the world of macro photography and you're dealing with these lenses, well, you've changed up potentially the magnification factor that you're dealing with, which is now impacting your understanding and that feel that you've got for the depth of field. So I feel like the best way to illustrate this is to just show you a muffin, because everybody loves muffins, right? So we've got this muffin, we want to shoot this macro shot because we're like, yes, we have this macro lens, let's put it to work, make this muffin look monumental. But as you can see, shooting this at f2.8, it's really narrow, right? And that we're only getting the focus there on the front of the muffin. And to me, it feels distracting because we're missing quite a bit of the muffin, right? So let's go ahead and stop it to f4. So we're getting a little bit more, that we take it now to 6.3. Now we're getting more, right? And then we take it into f9. And again, for those of you who are in food, who go for more of that wide open shot, you're like, I never shoot f9. Now for those of you who shoot f9 are like, ain't no thing, it's what I do every day. And then taking it one step further up to f16 so that we've got the front of the muffin all the way back to that middle top part of the muffin, that we've got a wide enough depth of field in order to have all of our subject in focus. And just as an aside, for those of you who are familiar with the exposure triangle and how those incremental changes that I was making to the f-stops, how that was impacting my exposure, obviously here on the back end, what you didn't see was that I was increasing the output on my flash with each subsequent stop up so that I could maintain the same exposure across all those images, despite the change in the aperture, because our aperture went from wide open all the way to really small. Now, one other thing to keep in mind, a principle that's in play here as we're talking about aperture and depth of field is that also the distance from the camera to your subject also has an impact on how that depth of field is going to look. And so the closer you are to the subject, the more shallow the depth of field, and then the further you are away from the subject or the background or what have you, the wider that depth of field is going to look. So just keep that in mind. For the most part, in these demonstrations, when we're talking about macro photography, we're really close up, and so we're dealing with that really narrow depth of field. But as you move further away from the subject, understand that that's also going to have an impact on that depth of field. So now maybe you're like, okay, great, Joni. So whenever I'm shooting macro photography or I'm using some sort of lens situation with a greater magnification factor, I just have to make sure to shoot a wider depth of field and use higher f numbers. Yes, but there is something to pay attention to and be careful of. There's a little footnote here on page 13. It's like a little aside. It's actually quite important. Something, if you're not familiar with this, is that stopping down beyond the optimal aperture will result in a loss of sharpness resulting from diffraction blur caused by light reflecting off the aperture blades. So what were we doing, right? As we were going from f2 to f4 to f5.6, 7.1, right? That we were started with the aperture being wide open. And then as those numbers got higher, the opening gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to like f16, f20, right? Gets smaller and smaller. Well, you can take it then to a point where you're sort of beyond the optimal range for that given lens, that you start to see this diffraction blur effect occur. And so if I do a little side-by-side comparison, like I zoom in super close up on this muffin, and I compare shooting this at f6.3, we're looking at that sugar, right? And then we compare that to shooting it at f16, that there is a loss in sharpness, right? And so you're like, oh, I know so many of you are sharpness fiends out there. I get so many questions about how do I make my images sharper? Well, by paying attention to what is the optimal range for your given lens. And every lens is going to be different. So this is for sure something to play with, experiment with, take a subject and shoot it at various apertures and take it all the way up to the top high numbers that you have on that given lens that you can take it to, and just compare, look at that sharpness and how it changes. Now, there is sort of a suggested sort of general rule of thumb. I will list that down in the description box below, but it is something to pay attention to. So now you're like, okay, this is a quandary, Joni, right? So we want that wider depth of field, but we don't want to take our lens too far. Well, then that's why he dives even further into this book, into the topic of focus stacking. The basic idea with focus stacking is that we take a particular image and then we continue to take multiple versions of that image, but with slight adjustments to that focal plane. So by adjusting our focus and changing it ever so slightly, and then combining those all into a composite image so that we have that sharpness that we love from that optimal aperture on that given lens, but then we also have the depth of field that we desire on these small subjects that we're shooting really close up. But I've linked my favorite video on the topic of focus stacking. I think he does a really fantastic job of going through just how to set up the scene properly, what are the various tools that you're going to need in order to achieve that, the softwares to process that, and a really great example of a beautiful macro shot. But wait, that's not the entire picture. And what I don't want is I don't want you to leave this video thinking, okay, Joni said, because we're shooting macro photography, we have to shoot at a higher F number with a wider depth of field. You got to watch out for that word have. You don't have to do anything. What you should do is shoot the kind of images that you want, shoot at the depth of field that makes you happy. And so one of the things that I love in this book, there's a section starting on page 170 called Creative Experiments. And it just goes through the various different kinds of experiments and things you can play with to, get outside the box when it comes to macro photography. And it's mentioned here, shallow focus can be a tool as well. We've been living in these higher F numbers, but there's no reason that we can't use a super shallow depth of field to create some interesting images. And so you can see we've got this image here of these flowers. This was mostly my excuse to buy myself flowers because I love flowers. So we're here at f16, and then we're just going to take this incrementally. We're going to change that aperture. So we're going down to f8, So we're, losing a little bit of the detail in the background, but we're still, mostly in focus. We're taking this now down to 5.6, narrowing that depth of field even more. Down to f2.8. Oh, we're getting real dreamy, which is very fitting for the subject, right? Whenever we're considering an image, we've just got to think, what's the purpose of this image? What's the feeling and emotion we're trying to evoke? And with these beautiful, dreamy, creamy flowers, I want something that, I want the image to reflect that feeling. And so in this case, to me, that more narrow depth of field is helping me do that. And then we take it to the maximum aperture for this particular lens at f1.4. And much of that flower is out of focus. But to me, the area where the eye is drawn, based on just the rules of composition, right, is that our eye is going straight into the center of that flower. And so to me, ensuring that the focus was there and that plane of focus was resting right on that center part, there was some adjusting, because again, that depth of field is so very narrow that just a hair of an adjustment really made a huge difference in where that focus was resting. Now, I know there are plenty out there who are like, well, wait a minute, I'm really struggling with focus in the first place. Definitely check out my video on how to get sharp focus. There are definitely some techniques, some things in your camera that maybe you're not familiar with that can really help you to ensure that you can get that tack sharp focus, and that you can then really leverage all of these tools in terms of macro photography, that narrow depth of field and an intentional placement of focus. But just like every video, I hope this gets you excited to go experiment, to try some of these things out, that if there were some ideas that you weren't familiar with, that you go put those into play. Feel free to tag me. I'm over on Instagram at The Bite Shot. I'd love to see what you're working on. And next week, we will be back with another video based on this book right here from the Bite Shot Book Club, talking about some more creative applications for macro photography. And two, you don't want to miss next week, because I'm going to be kicking off a week-long challenge in macro photography that then we will return a week after that for some special judging and sharing of your photos. And so thank you so much, as always, for hanging out here on The Bite Shot with me. It's a treat to get to teach you. I hope you stay out of trouble, and I'll see you soon, okay? Bye!